Okay, let's get to our panel. Joining us from Singapore is Baozhen Luo. She is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at Western Washington University. With me here in the studio is Zhang. He is Chief Correspondent for Shanghai Wen Hui Daily in the Washington D.C. Bureau. Also joining us from California is Wang Feng. He is Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Irvine, and he's the former director of the Brookings-Tsinghua Center for Public Policy. Also with us here in the studio is Richard Jackson. He is president of the Global Aging Institute. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Zhang, let me start with you. China had a one-child policy for decades. Then that changed about 2 years ago. Couples can now have 2 children. What prompted the change?
I think until a few years ago, the main challenge for China on population is that we are feeling pressure to have too many people in our country. But suddenly in the last 2 or 3 years, the government is feeling that we are lack of people, we are lack of population. We need more people for at least 2 or 3 reasons. One is that in the coming a few years, we may need more people to work. We may need more workforce to meet the demand of like manufacturing and different kind of fields of the economy. The second one is also that China's society is becoming much more aged than a couple of years ago. We have much more aged people than before. And in China, those people's social welfare will be dependent on the payment of the younger working people. So we need more payment from younger generations to support the pensions of those aged, retired people.
Okay, let's bring in Baozhen Luo. She is in Singapore. And Baozhen Luo, this new policy has now been in effect for 2 years. How successful has it been?
The two-child policy, the success, I think it's obviously, we don't see in short term, after 2 years, we don't see some success. On one hand, I think it still takes some time to see the effect of the policy. But on the other hand, I think it's a kind of a global trend that as the society become more urbanized, as the society become more modernized, and especially as women receive more education, have more career aspiration, and especially in society where women status is considerably lower than men, such as in society like Japan, South Korea, or like the province of Taiwan in China, the fertility rate is very low. But in other countries like Northern European countries, even though very modernized, the fertility rate is pretty good actually, because there's a lot of public support. So I think for China to see any kind of a positive shift in the fertility rate, we have to also really consider some adjustment in public policies.
So, Baozhen Luo, when you say that this is a global trend, that we find these lower rates of birth throughout the world, are the reasons the same in most countries? The fact that raising a child gets more expensive, that there are housing costs to be contend with, education costs to be contend with, are those reasons pretty much the same around the world?
Well, I think it's globally, what we see is sort of this structural economic transformation. The kind of labor force we need for today's economy requires higher education, and the labor force has become a lot more competitive than in the past. So the investment for education, for the well-being of your children, to face that kind of fierce competition on a global scale, it's much more intense than in the past. So no wonder having children is a lot more expensive than before, especially in newly emerging economies, countries that have developed really fast in the past 2, 3, 4 decades. The cost of having children, the opportunity cost is really high. So that is a global phenomenon. But as I said earlier, in countries like Scandinavian countries such as Norway, Denmark, or even country like France or a country like Israel with extensive public support, especially support for women, we do see some increase in fertility rates. Their pronatalist policies have become pretty prominent.
Okay, let's go to California and talk to Wang Feng. Wang Feng, trying to increase fertility rates, as we've just heard, is not something that is unique to China. We are seeing this in other Asian countries around the globe as well. But for China, what is the challenge to increasing birth rates?
The first challenge is a small one, which is the government needs to lift all remaining restrictions on childbearing. Because even with the relaxation for people to have 2 children, the policy for birth control has not been totally lifted. So that's a small step that can be done fairly easily. Now, in terms of policies to increase fertility, this really involves a fundamental societal change that includes, as the previous speaker said, try to improve the status of women, to protect them, the women in the labor market, and also to change policies on migration control so parents can be with their children, adult children, to help with child care, and then programs such as child care facilities publicly supported, and more generous benefits for maternity leave and paternity leave. Now, all those policies could potentially help, but they are not so far, with the exception of few countries. In most places, they have not been shown to be effective. So I think China is really going against a historical tide, that is, young people. The question is not why they are not having children. The question is why they would want to have any children.
Right. Richard, we take a country like China, the most populous country in the world, 1.2 billion people. It seems counterintuitive when we figure out that the government 2 years ago decided that that's not enough people, but it's a question of age groups, isn't it?
Well, right, exactly. In the late 70s and early 80s, when the one-child policy was first put in place, the problem seemed clearly to be too many babies. Population growth was rapid, and it seemed to be pushing China towards some sort of a Malthusian endgame, where the population would outstrip the country's capacity to support it. So the one-child policy was put in place, but at the time, policymakers didn't give much thought to the ultimate sequel, the ultimate consequence of a one-child policy, which is a rapidly aging population. That lay over the horizon in some distant future. Well, the government's gradual relaxation of the one-child policy in recent years and the shift to a two-child policy is a belated recognition that that once distant future has now arrived. And unfortunately, as we've heard from some of the other panelists, the government is finding that it may be more difficult, considerably more difficult, to raise the birth rate than it was to bring it down. Indeed, in China, as throughout most of the world, the small family has become the new social norm.
You want to say something?
Yes, yeah. I think that is very much correct. In fact, I think the statistics is showing the real issue now is not whether to have a second child. The real issue is whether to have a child. And the statistics show that in last year, we have about 8 million newborn babies to be second child. And only 7 million new childs are first babies. That means those kind of young generation, young guys who do not want to first baby, and they won't be intended to have a second baby at all. Like my brother-in-law, he's now 30 years old, and he's living very comfortably. And at the age of 30, he has no plan to get married, not to mention have any kids in the future.